It was a quiet and chilly November morning in the quaint town of Elkwood, Kentucky. The golden leaves clung stubbornly to the towering oaks that lined the narrow streets, rustling gently in the breeze. A town of no more than 2,000 souls, Elkwood was the kind of place where time moved slowly, where neighbors greeted each other by name, and where the local church bell rang every Sunday morning, a comforting echo of tradition. But inside the old rectory at the edge of town, the air was heavy with silence, a silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Father Bernard Callahan, a retired priest, sat slumped in a worn leather armchair, staring out the frost-bitten window. The once vibrant man of faith, who had spent decades preaching hope and love to his congregation, now seemed a shadow of his former self. His shoulders sagged under the weight of time and heartbreak, his gray hair thin and unkempt, and his glasses perpetually smudged from absent-minded polishing. His once bright, piercing eyes had dulled, clouded with a sadness that even prayer could not seem to lift. Bernard had devoted his entire life to serving others, often at the expense of his own family. For years he had told himself it was a noble sacrifice, that his calling to God was higher than the pull of worldly attachments. But now, in the twilight of his life, the consequences of those choices were painfully clear. His wife, Elaine, had passed away 6 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. His 3 adult children, Rebecca, Samuel, and Claire, had drifted away, busy with their own lives in distant cities. At first, they called and visited, but over time, the calls became less frequent, the visits shorter, until eventually, they stopped altogether. The last time Bernard had heard from Rebecca, his eldest, was nearly 2 years ago, a rushed Christmas phone call full of polite small talk but void of warmth. Samuel, his middle child, hadn't spoken to him since Elaine's funeral, their relationship fractured by years of unresolved tension. And Claire, his youngest, had sent a postcard from Colorado months ago, with a generic "thinking of you" scribbled on the back. It was a far cry from the laughter-filled dinners and bedtime stories he once shared with his children when they were young. Now, all that remained were faded photographs and memories that felt like a cruel echo of what once was. The house itself mirrored Bernard's isolation. The once cozy rectory had fallen into disrepair. The roof leaked during heavy rains, the floors creaked with every step, and the heater groaned as it struggled to warm the drafty old home. The only sound that filled the silence was the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock, its rhythm steady and unyielding, a reminder of time slipping away. Despite his loneliness, Bernard continued his rituals. He rose every morning at dawn, recited his prayers, and made tea in a chipped porcelain cup. He walked to the church, even though his legs ached and the congregation had dwindled to a handful of elderly parishioners. But the joy he once felt in his ministry was gone, replaced by a sense of duty and a hollow ache. He often found himself wondering if anyone would notice if he simply stopped showing up. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Bernard sat in his armchair with a Bible resting on his lap. He wasn't reading, though. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the framed photograph of Elaine that sat on the side table. Her kind eyes and gentle smile seemed to mock him, a painful reminder of all he had lost. Was it worth it? He whispered to the empty room, his voice thick with emotion. Did I do the right thing, Elaine? Was this what God wanted for me? The answer, of course, did not come. Only the faint whistle of the wind outside broke the stillness. Bernard sighed and closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion of loneliness wash over him. But that night, as the world outside the rectory fell into a deep, wintry slumber, something extraordinary was happening just beyond the garden gate. A stray dog, its fur matted and streaked with mud, wandered into the overgrown yard. Its dark, soulful eyes scanned the house, as if searching for something or someone. The dog was small, with floppy ears and a tail that wagged hesitantly, as though unsure of its welcome. It sniffed the air, catching the faint scent of Bernard's cooking from the kitchen window. Driven by hunger and an inexplicable instinct, the dog curled up on the cold, cracked porch, shivering but determined to stay. When Bernard awoke the next morning and opened the door to fetch the newspaper, he nearly stumbled over the unexpected guest. The dog looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes, its tail thumping weakly against the wooden floor. Bernard froze, his heart skipping a beat. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was dreaming, but as the dog let out a soft, almost apologetic whimper, Bernard's heart stirred in a way it hadn't in years. "Well," he murmured, his voice a mix of surprise and curiosity, "where did you come from?" He crouched down slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and extended a cautious hand. The dog sniffed his fingers before giving them a tentative lick, its eyes never leaving Bernard's face. In that instant, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile thread of connection that neither fully understood, but both felt deeply. Bernard glanced around, half expecting to see an owner rushing forward to claim the dog, but the yard was empty. Just the wind and the rustling leaves. It was clear this little creature had no home, no family, just like him. "All right," Bernard said softly, his voice tinged with a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Let's get you something to eat." As he led the dog inside, unaware of how profoundly this moment would alter the course of his life, the old priest felt the faintest glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The dog, now nestled at Father Bernard's feet in the warmth of the rectory's modest kitchen, devoured the scraps of leftover stew as though it hadn't eaten in days. Bernard stood by the counter, watching the creature with a mix of curiosity and unease. The dog was a scrappy little thing, its fur a patchwork of black and white streaked with mud. It had no collar, no sign that it belonged to anyone, and its ribs pressed sharply against its thin frame. Yet there was something about its eyes, those deep, imploring eyes, that tugged at Bernard's heart. When the dog finished eating, it looked up at him and wagged its tail, a hopeful thump-thump against the kitchen floor. Bernard sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I suppose you'll need a name," he muttered. After a moment's thought, he settled on Charlie. It wasn't much, but it would do. That night, Charlie curled up on an old blanket Bernard placed near the fireplace. As the dog slept, Bernard sat in his armchair, staring into the flickering flames. He told himself this was temporary, that he would take the dog to the local shelter in the morning. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. There was a strange comfort in having another living soul in the house again, even if it was just a stray dog. It filled a tiny corner of the vast emptiness that had consumed him for so long. The next day, Bernard drove Charlie to the nearest animal shelter, a small, underfunded facility on the outskirts of town. The woman at the front desk, a kind but weary volunteer, explained that they were already overcrowded and could only take Charlie if absolutely necessary. She looked at Bernard with a knowing smile. "He seems to like you," she said, gesturing to the dog who was glued to Bernard's side. "And from the looks of it, you could use the company." Bernard hesitated, glancing down at Charlie. The dog wagged its tail expectantly, as if sensing the weight of the moment. With a resigned sigh, Bernard said, "All right, I'll keep him, for now." But for now quickly turned into days, then weeks. Charlie settled into life at the rectory, as if he'd always belonged there. He followed Bernard everywhere, from the kitchen to the church, where he sat quietly in the pews during morning prayers. The parishioners, most of whom had known Bernard for decades, were charmed by the dog's presence. Mrs. Adler, an elderly widow who attended Mass every Sunday, often brought treats for Charlie, calling him a blessing in disguise. For Bernard, Charlie became more than just a companion. The dog's unwavering loyalty and gentle demeanor began to soften the walls Bernard had built around his heart. Charlie had a way of grounding him, pulling him out of the dark spiral of his thoughts. When Bernard sat by the window, lost in memories of Elaine or the aching silence left by his children, Charlie would nudge his hand with a wet nose or rest his head on Bernard's lap, as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." Still, the shadows of Bernard's past lingered. His estrangement from his children weighed heavily on him, a source of constant guilt and regret. He often found himself staring at the old landline phone on the kitchen counter, willing it to ring, but it never did. His prayers, too, felt hollow. Though he continued his daily rituals, he struggled to find the connection to God that had once been his guiding light. One cold December evening, as Bernard and Charlie sat by the fire, the weight of it all became too much. Bernard buried his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling with silent sobs. Charlie, sensing his distress, climbed into his lap, a bold move for a dog of his size, and licked Bernard's face. Surprised, Bernard looked up, meeting Charlie's eyes. There was a depth in them, an unspoken understanding that felt almost human. In that moment, Bernard whispered, "Why did you come to me, Charlie? What am I supposed to learn from you?" That question lingered in Bernard's mind over the following weeks. He began to notice small changes in himself, subtle but significant. He smiled more, laughed at Charlie's antics, and even felt a flicker of joy during long walks through the snow-dusted woods. The dog had brought light into his life, a reminder that love could still exist in the simplest of forms. But the true test of their bond came one fateful night in January. A powerful snowstorm swept through Elkwood, cutting off power to the rectory and plunging the town into darkness. The wind howled like a mournful wail, rattling the old windows and sending chills through the drafty house. Bernard lit a few candles and wrapped himself in a blanket, grateful for Charlie's warm presence by his side. Around midnight, Charlie began to whimper and paw at the front door. At first, Bernard thought the dog needed to go outside, but when he opened the door, Charlie bolted out into the blizzard, barking furiously. Alarmed, Bernard grabbed his coat and flashlight and followed. Charlie led him to the edge of the property, where Bernard found a young woman collapsed in the snow. Her face was pale, her lips blue, and she was barely conscious. Bernard's heart raced as he knelt beside her, shaking her gently. "Miss, can you hear me?" The woman stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open. Bernard didn't recognize her, but it was clear she needed help and fast. With Charlie barking urgently at his side, Bernard managed to carry her back to the house. He wrapped her in blankets, made hot tea, and sat by her side until she regained enough strength to speak. Her name was Lily, and she had gotten lost in the storm while driving to visit her grandmother in a nearby town. As Bernard listened to her story, he couldn't help but marvel at Charlie's intuition. If the dog hadn't insisted on going outside, Lily might not have survived the night. Bernard looked at Charlie, who sat quietly by the fire, his eyes glowing with a calm sense of purpose. "You saved her," Bernard murmured, his voice filled with awe. The morning after the storm, the rectory was bathed in an eerie, cold light as the sun reflected off the thick blanket of snow outside. The storm had passed, leaving a serene stillness in its wake. Bernard sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in his hands, the steam curling upward and warming his face. Across from him sat Lily, the young woman Charlie had saved. She was wrapped in one of Bernard's thick woolen blankets, her cheeks still pale but showing a faint blush of returning color. Charlie lay at her feet, his tail wagging softly as she absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears. "You said his name is Charlie?" Lily asked, her voice still weak but carrying a note of warmth. "Yes," Bernard replied, glancing at the dog. "Though after last night, I'm starting to think he's more angel than dog." Lily smiled faintly. "I don't know how to thank you, or him, if he hadn't found me." She paused, her voice catching. Bernard nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He reached out and patted her hand gently. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." As Lily recovered over the next few days, Bernard learned more about her. She was only 26, an artist from Cincinnati, and had been on her way to visit her grandmother in a neighboring town. Her parents had passed away years ago, and her grandmother was her only remaining family. The storm had caught her off guard, and her car had skidded off the icy road into a ditch. With no cell service and the bitter cold setting in, she had tried to walk to safety but had become disoriented in the blizzard. Listening to her story, Bernard couldn't help but feel a strange connection to Lily. Her loneliness mirrored his own in many ways, and he found himself opening up to her about his life. He told her about Elaine, about his children, and about the quiet ache that had settled in his heart over the years. It wasn't something he talked about often, if ever, but there was something about Lily's presence, and perhaps Charlie's as well, that made him feel safe enough to share. Lily, in turn, spoke about the challenges of being an artist, of trying to find her place in the world, and of longing for deeper connections. They talked for hours by the fire, their words weaving a tapestry of shared pain and hope. And all the while, Charlie sat between them, a silent but steadfast presence. But while Lily's stay brought a brief sense of renewal to Bernard's life, it also stirred something deeper within him. an unshakable question about his own purpose and whether he could mend the broken ties with his own family. Watching Lily speak so lovingly about her grandmother reminded him of the bonds he had let slip away with his children. One snowy afternoon, as Lily prepared to leave for her grandmother's house, Bernard stood in the doorway with Charlie at his side. "Thank you for saving me," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Not just from the storm, but for everything. I don't know why I ended up here, but I feel like it was meant to be." Bernard nodded, his throat tightening. "Perhaps it was," he said softly. "Take care of yourself, Lily, and don't forget, you're not alone." As she drove away, Bernard watched her car disappear down the snowy road. He felt a pang of sadness, but also a strange sense of clarity. Lily's gratitude and resilience had awakened something within him, a desire to reconnect with his children, no matter how much time had passed or how difficult it might be. That evening, Bernard sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old landline phone. His hands trembled as he dialed Rebecca's number, the first of his 3 children. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Rebecca," Bernard said, his voice unsteady. "It's Dad." There was a long pause on the other end, and Bernard's heart pounded in his chest. He feared she might hang up, that the years of silence had built an insurmountable wall between them. But then, Rebecca's voice came through, softer this time. "Dad, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know," Bernard said quickly, the words spilling out in a rush. I wanted to call, to hear your voice, and to say I'm sorry for everything, for not being there for you and your siblings the way I should have been. I know I can't change the past, but I'd like to try to fix things, if you'll let me." There was another pause, but this one felt different, less like a wall and more like a door slowly creaking open. "I'd like that," Rebecca said finally. "I think we all would." The conversation wasn't long, but it was enough. It was a beginning, a fragile but hopeful step toward reconciliation. After hanging up, Bernard sat back in his chair, tears streaming down his face. Charlie, sensing his emotions, rested his head on Bernard's lap. Bernard stroked the dog's fur, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Over the next few weeks, Bernard made similar calls to Samuel and Claire. The conversations were tentative, filled with awkward pauses and emotions too big to fully express, but they were meaningful. Slowly but surely, the threads of connection began to weave back together. One Sunday morning, as Bernard prepared to head to church, he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. He peeked out the window and froze. Standing by the car were Rebecca, Samuel, and Claire. They looked older than he remembered, their faces lined with the passage of time, but they were here. They had come. Bernard stepped outside, Charlie bounding ahead of him. His children hesitated for a moment before Rebecca stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "We've missed you, Dad," she whispered. Bernard held her tightly, his tears falling freely. Samuel and Claire joined the embrace, and for the first time in years, Bernard felt the warmth of his family surrounding him. Charlie barked joyfully, circling them as if to celebrate the reunion he had unknowingly set into motion. The reunion that snowy Sunday morning was more than Bernard could have ever hoped for. As he held his children in his arms, it felt as though years of regret and longing melted away. The emotions he had kept locked inside, his guilt, his sorrow, his yearning for forgiveness, poured out in quiet tears. For the first time in years, the rectory was filled with life. Rebecca, Samuel, and Claire stayed for lunch, and though their conversations were tentative at first, laughter soon began to spill through the rooms. Bernard couldn't stop looking at them, marveling at how they had grown into such remarkable adults. Rebecca, always the responsible eldest, spoke about her work as a schoolteacher and her 2 young children. Samuel, once rebellious and distant, now worked as a nurse and shared stories about the patients he cared for. Claire, the free spirit of the family, was running a small bakery in Colorado, where she created desserts inspired by their mother's recipes. Bernard listened intently, soaking in every detail. And as they spoke, Charlie moved from one family member to the next, wagging his tail and basking in their attention. It was as though the dog knew this moment was special, that he had played an important role in bringing them all back together. After that day, things began to change for Bernard in ways he never thought possible. His children started visiting more often, and they even made plans to spend Easter together, something they hadn't done as a family since Elaine's passing. Bernard also began writing letters to his grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandmother and the adventures he and Charlie were having. For the first time in years, the rectory felt like a home again. But the most profound change was within Bernard himself. His connection with Charlie had taught him a lesson that all his years of ministry had somehow failed to impart, that love didn't need to be grand or perfect to be meaningful. It could be found in the smallest gestures, a wagging tail, a shared meal, a simple phone call. Charlie had shown him that even the most broken hearts could be healed with patience, loyalty, and unconditional love. One crisp spring morning, Bernard decided to take Charlie on a walk to the nearby cemetery. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, not since Elaine's funeral. The thought of standing by her grave had always felt too overwhelming, a reminder of all the ways he had failed her. But now, with Charlie by his side, he felt ready. When they arrived at the cemetery, Bernard knelt by Elaine's gravestone, brushing away the leaves that had gathered there over the years. His fingers traced the inscription, "Elaine Callahan, beloved wife, mother, and friend. I miss you every day," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I want you to know I'm trying. The kids were here last week. They're doing so well, Elaine. You'd be so proud of them. I think they've forgiven me, or at least they're trying to, and it's because of him." He glanced down at Charlie, who was sitting quietly beside him, his dark eyes fixed on Bernard. "This little one, he saved me, in more ways than I can count." For a long while, Bernard sat in silence, letting the memories of Elaine and the weight of the past wash over him. But instead of the overwhelming sorrow he had always feared, he felt something else, a sense of peace. He realized that Elaine would have wanted this for him, to find joy and connection again, even after her passing. As Bernard stood to leave, he felt a lightness in his heart that he hadn't felt in years. He looked down at Charlie, who wagged his tail in approval, as if sensing Bernard's newfound peace. "Come on, boy," Bernard said, smiling. "Let's go home." Back at the rectory, Bernard began to make changes. He repaired the leaky roof, replaced the drafty windows, and even planted a small garden in Elaine's memory. Charlie was his constant companion through it all, watching him hammer nails and dig up the soil with the same quiet devotion that had become the cornerstone of their bond. But the most significant change was in the church. Bernard had always approached his ministry with a sense of duty, but now he preached with a renewed sense of purpose. His sermons became more personal, drawing from his experiences with Charlie and his family. He spoke about forgiveness and second chances, about the unexpected ways that grace could enter one's life, even in the form of a scrappy stray dog. The congregation, though small, was deeply moved by Bernard's words. Mrs. Adler, who rarely spoke after losing her husband years ago, came up to Bernard after one Sunday service, tears in her eyes. "You've brought hope back into this church," she said, her voice trembling, "and into my heart." Word of Bernard's transformation began to spread through Elkwood, and the once dwindling congregation slowly began to grow. Families who had stopped attending in church returned, drawn by the warmth and authenticity of Bernard's message. Charlie became a beloved fixture of the church, often sitting by Bernard's side as he delivered his sermons. The children adored him, and even the adults couldn't resist sneaking him treats during coffee hour. But Bernard never forgot the source of it all. The night Charlie had appeared on his doorstep, cold and hungry, but full of an inexplicable light. That little dog had given him the courage to face his past, the strength to heal his relationships, and the faith to believe in love again. One sunny afternoon, as Bernard and Charlie sat on the rectory porch, Bernard stroked the dog's fur and said, "You know, Charlie, I used to think I was the one who rescued you, but now I realize it was the other way around. You saved me. You showed me how to live again." Charlie looked up at him with those deep, soulful eyes, his tail wagging softly. In that moment, Bernard felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Charlie, but for the second chance at life and love that the dog had given him. The seasons passed, and the small town of Elkwood transformed with the rhythms of time. The oaks shed their leaves in autumn, blanketed the streets with snow in winter, and burst into vibrant green in spring. Life at the rectory, however, remained steady, filled with the newfound warmth that Father Bernard and Charlie had brought to each other's lives. The once lonely priest now lived in a home filled with laughter, connection, and purpose. His children visited often, and the rectory became a gathering place for family holidays and quiet weekends. Rebecca's children would race around the yard, giggling as Charlie chased them in playful circles. Samuel and Claire would sit with Bernard on the porch, reminiscing about their childhood while Charlie lounged at their feet. Bernard's sermons, too, had become something of a legend in the small town. People came not just for the teachings of Scripture, but for the heartfelt stories of love, loss, and redemption that Bernard wove into each service. He spoke often about Charlie, calling him his unexpected angel. But it was more than just words. Bernard had changed, truly changed. The walls around his heart had been replaced with bridges, and the cracks in his soul had been mended by the simple, profound love of a dog who had appeared when he needed him most. One summer afternoon, Bernard sat on the rectory porch with Charlie curled up beside him. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the air carried the sweet scent of freshly cut grass. Bernard held a worn photograph of Elaine in his hands, his fingers gently tracing her smiling face. "I wish you could see this, Elaine," he murmured. "You always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And somehow, that little dog reminded me of what you always knew, that love never truly leaves us. It just finds new ways to show itself." Charlie, as if understanding Bernard's words, lifted his head and placed it on the old priest's lap. Bernard chuckled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the rectory, Bernard closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. The weight of the years no longer felt like a burden but a gift, a testament to the power of second chances, forgiveness, and the enduring bond between a man and his dog. Final reflection. Father Bernard's journey is a reminder to all of us that life can surprise us in the most extraordinary ways, even when we feel at our lowest. It reminds us that no matter how broken we feel, love has the power to mend us, whether it comes from family, friends, or the quiet companionship of a loyal dog. Charlie wasn't just a stray, he was a symbol of hope, a spark that reignited Bernard's spirit. Through his unwavering loyalty, he showed Bernard the importance of living in the moment, embracing love where it's found, and having the courage to reach out and heal old wounds. As we face our own struggles and heartbreaks, perhaps we can take a lesson from Father Bernard and Charlie, to trust in the unexpected, to forgive ourselves and others, and to always remain open to the simple, beautiful ways that love can change our lives.